Today we'll discuss the comparable interface and we'll do an example code implementing the comparable interface. And comparable only has one method as described in the notes that we did. So there's only one method in the comparable interface, so we're going to implement that method. So we've created three classes: main.java, compare.java, and clown.java. So we'll start in compare.java. So we'll create the class, say public class compare, and we'll implement. So public class compare implements comparable of generic type integer. So public class compare implements comparable of generic type integer object. So we'll create some variables and make sure we'll make them private so we satisfy the rules of encapsulation. Make sure you do that so other classes can access and change your variables. So we'll say private integer and we'll call it obj. Then we'll create a constructor. We do that by just referencing the class name, so public compare, and then we'll pass in an object. So we'll say integer obj. So we'll say this dot obj equals to obj. So we're saying, when we use the this reference, we're saying this dot global variable obj equals to the parameter obj. So now we're setting them to be the same. So then we'll implement the only method in the comparable interface. So we'll say public. It's an int. It's of type int, so we have to return an int. So we'll say public int compareTo integer obj1. So here we can just write implement the compareTo method in comparable interface. So we'll say if obj is less than obj1, then we'll return -1. Else if obj is equal to obj1, then we'll return 0. Then else, there's only one more possibility. It can be less than, equal to, or greater than. So we'll say else return 1. So -1, 0, and 1. And we'll just say else if obj is greater than obj1, just so you don't get confused. That should be all, so we'll just save it. I think that's all. So we'll go to the main class. We'll just say we'll create the class, so public class main. And then we'll say public, do the command line, so public static void main string array args. And we'll create an object of type compare. So we'll say compare, we'll call it compare lowercase equals new compare and that compare object is going to hold something. It's going to hold an integer named obj. So we'll just say it's holding like 9. Then we'll say system.out.println compare object dot compareTo. We'll invoke the compareTo method, and we'll say compare that to 2. Save it and run it. So we return 1. So what it's saying is we've created an object of the compare class named compare, and we've set that equal to a new compare class. So we've created an object of type compare class named compare, and that object is holding an integer 9. So then we're saying compare object. So the compareTo interface, it compares objects. So we're saying compare object compareTo 2, because in the compareTo method it also is holding an object. It's holding an integer obj1. So we're comparing obj to obj1. If obj is less than obj1, it returns -1. So we're comparing 9 to 2. So if 9 is less than 2, well, it's not. It's 9 is greater than 2, so that condition is false. So else if obj 9, which is equal to 9, is equal to obj1, which is equal to 2, well, that's also false because 9 and 2 are not equal. So then we'll say the last condition which is possible if obj is greater than obj1, then we'll say return 1. That satisfies the condition. That's true. Therefore we return 1, which is what we wanted, because we're comparing two objects here, obj and obj1. So compare is obj. Compare is holding the object obj, which is 9. And compareTo, we're comparing to the second object, which is an integer object, the wrapper class for int, the primitive type int. The wrapper class for an int primitive type is an integer object. So we're comparing 9 to 2. That's why we got 1. Sorry, 1, not -1. So we'll now say, we'll now go to the clown class, and we'll create the class so we can compare some objects that we create. So we'll say public class clown implements comparable of type generic type clown. So we're comparing clown objects. So we're going to implement a way to define, we're going to implement a way to compare the clown object. So we'll create some variables here. We'll make them private. So that way we're following the rules of encapsulation. So we'll say private string name. Then we'll say private int ID. Each clown will have an ID and it'll have a name. And we'll create a constructor, public. We'll create a constructor by referencing the class name. So public clown, and that clown object will have a string parameter named name and also have an int parameter and ID. Then we'll use the this keyword to instantiate the variable, so we'll say this dot name equals to name. We'll say this dot ID equals to the parameter ID. So we're saying this dot, the global variable name, is equal to the parameter name. So now we'll implement the compareTo method. So we'll say public int. It returns an int, so we have to return an int. So we'll say public int compareTo, and it'll take a clown obj. It's going to take a clown object as a parameter. So then we'll say, well, we have to create some methods here. Sorry, I forgot about that. So we'll create some accessor methods to access some of the variables that we'll need. There's a way to do this with right click, but it's easy just to do it this way. So I'll just say public string. It's going to return a string. Call it get name. And then we'll return name. Accessor methods are pretty easy to write. So then we'll say public int get ID. And we'll say return ID. And then we'll just create one more method just in case. Public string toString. We'll override the toString method. And then we'll return ID plus name. Remember, the toString method is a method of the object class. So we're overriding the object's definition to return something that we need instead. So then, I think that's all we need. So then we'll go back to the compareTo method. And we'll use the same logic as the other class, except we'll access we can't compare objects directly because Java doesn't know what kind of objects these are, and if they're strings, they're ints, they're doubles, they're characters. Java doesn't know how to compare them, so we have to write a way to compare them so Java will know what the object's holding. So we'll say if getID is less than obj dot getID, then we'll return -1. So what we're saying is if one of the clowns that's holding an ID, if that ID is less than the other clown that's also holding an ID, then return -1. Then we'll say else if get ID is equal to obj dot get ID, then we'll return 0, because if they're equal and the comparable interface wants us to return 0. Then we'll say else. There's only one more possibility. It can be less than, equal to, or greater than. So we'll say return 1. Less than, equal to, and then so say one last possibility is greater than. So we'll return 1. Get name, get ID, toString, call class clown implements variable of generic type clown, string name, int ID, constructor takes 2 parameters. We've instantiated this dot name equals name. Should be alright, so we'll just go to the main class. Then we'll say we'll create another variable, so we'll say int, we'll call result, and then we'll just create some clown objects, so we'll say clown1 equals new clown, and we'll call it Bob. And then we'll pass 4 for a number for integer object. And then we'll create another clown, so we'll say clown2 equals new clown. We'll just call this clown Sally. And we'll give Sally 5 to hold. Then we'll say result equals clown1 dot compareTo clown2. Then we'll system.out dot print, and then we'll print result. Just save and run. So we got 1 for the first one because 9 is greater than 2. Because we're comparing objects. Here we're comparing integer objects, so 9 is greater than 2. And then for the second result we got -1 because 4 is less than 5. So what's happening here is we've created an object named clown1 of type clown. So clown1 equals new clown, and that clown is holding 2 parameters. In our clown constructor helps set up the object. So in that clown it's taking 2 parameters, a string name and an int ID. So when main created the object, we have to give it a name and an ID. Sorry, a name and an ID, or else we'll get an error. So then we created one clown object, which is holding Bob, and it's holding 4. Then we've created a second clown object named clown2 of type clown. It's holding the name Sally, and it's also holding an integer 5. So we're saying the result variable that we created is equal to clown1, which is holding 4 dot compareTo 5. So in our compareTo method, it's saying if getID. So getID is getID. So if clown1, right? So if clown1 dot getID is less than clown2 dot getID, because in the compare method, in the compareTo method, it's in the parameter, it's taking a clown object. So that's what we compare to. So when we say dot compareTo, it's gonna take a clown object, and that clown object is the second clown. It's a clown2, because we're comparing to a clown. So the clown here that we're comparing to is a second clown. So we're saying if clown.getID is less than, if clown1 getID is less than clown2.getID, return -1. Because when we create an object, we're going to use the first object to compare it to the second object. So clown1, we're comparing clown1 dot compareTo clown2. So we're saying clown1 dot getID dot compareTo clown2 dot getID. See here, clown1 dot getID is less than this one's taking a parameter where we said compare it to clown 2. So now clown 2 is a parameter. So clown1.getID is less than clown2.getID, which returns -1. It's not equal to, because 4 isn't equal to 5, right? So 4 equal to 5, that's false. So that's going to pass, it's going to hit this first parameter. It's going to hit the first if statement right away, because it's asking if 4 is less than 5. So it's not, I don't even think it's going to get to those. So pretty much, we got what we wanted here. So I hope everything's clear with the compareTo interface. So just remember, the compareTo, the comparable method interface, the comparable interface has a method compareTo, and that compareTo method compares objects. So you can only compare objects, you can't compare primitive types. So if you're going to try to pass a primitive type in the compareTo method, I think it's going to throw an error or an exception. It's going to ask for an object. So basically, if you want to compare a primitive type, you're going to have to use its corresponding wrapper class so that you can actually call an object. But if we were to put a string here, that would work because string is an object. So if we want to create our own way to compare objects, we'd have to implement a way to do that. So if we wanted to also compare strings, we could have done that as well. We would have had to make these, we would have had to change these methods, but it would have compared the objects lexicographically on the Unicode character index. Is going to compare it by the way each letter or symbol, capital or lowercase, has a number code on it. So it's going to say if like capital S is less than lowercase d or something like that, it's going to compare that, and that's how it's going to compare the objects. But in this class, we just wanted to compare them by an integer. So I'd hope that helps. Thanks.